Perfect. Thank you. And thank you for the introduction, Daniel, and thank you to everybody for having me. So, as discussed, I'm going to talk today about heated tobacco products and give a bit of a deep dive into really what is the last 5 years of my work around the clinical evidence on heated tobacco products. I just want to start us off with the usual bit of admin that I have no conflicts of interest, and of course myself and the rest of TCRG don't accept any money from the tobacco industry. And if you would like to find out more about our partners, funders, then you can do so on the University of Bath website. So heated tobacco. I'm going to assume that most people on this call know what heated tobacco products are. They often go by various different names. Heat not burn is quite a popular one, but for the duration of this presentation, I will call them heated tobacco products, or HTPs for short. I'm sure most people know that they come in two elements. The first is, of course, the electronic device. And then secondly, you have the tobacco sticks, which are almost like look like miniature cigarettes, which is what actually contains the tobacco leaf that is then inserted into the electronic device so that it can be heated and the user then inhales the emissions. Of course, as I've just explained, it's only the sticks that contain the tobacco. The device itself is purely an electronic device that contains no tobacco. And when these products were first brought to market in 2014, this sort of created a regulatory loophole whereby existing tobacco control regulation at the time may have only covered the sticks and not the device. And so these products were relatively easily brought to some markets. Since then, the market worldwide has grown rapidly, particularly in Asian countries. In fact, Euromonitor estimates the market to be worth around 30 billion US dollars currently worldwide. What's really interesting about the heated tobacco product market, though, is that it's almost entirely dominated by the transnational tobacco companies. And that's reflected, of course, in the most popular brands. In particular, of course, is PMI's famous IQOS device. Manufacturers like these companies like to use a variety of claims to try and market and sell heated tobacco products to consumers. Most famously, of course, is claims that heated tobacco products are reduced risk or less harmful alternatives to cigarettes. And underpinning those claims really is scientific research. And in particular, of course, is clinical evidence. And so in my research over the last 5 years, we sought to go into an examination, a deep dive, if you will, into the clinical data on heated tobacco products. And we started with a systematic review of the available heated tobacco product clinical trials. And we identified 40 interventional clinical trials on HTPs, mostly parallel and crossover randomized controlled trials. And in the first paper, we sought to look at how were these trials conducted or designed and reported, and what's the quality of these trials? So let's take a look at their characteristics. The first thing to note is that only 11 of them were conducted independently of the tobacco industry. The majority were affiliated or directly conducted by the tobacco industry. When it comes to their characteristics, the trials were relatively short in duration, ranging from about single use up to 12 months maximum, but the vast majority of these studies were 5 days or less in duration. Most of the trials were conducted in confined settings, that is to say, settings where the participants were monitored, usually in like residentials, and so their consumption and adherence to the protocol was strictly monitored. Almost all of the trials recruited healthy adult smokers. All of the studies included a cigarette comparison group, but only 14, most of actually them being independent studies, included an electronic cigarette comparative group, despite arguably being perhaps heated tobacco products' biggest market competitor. Biomarkers of exposure were the most measured and reported outcome amongst the trials. And in fact, most of the trials focused on the efficacy of heated tobacco products over their effectiveness, not least by restricting data analyses to only include participants who made a complete or near complete switch from cigarettes to heated tobacco products. And then lastly, 34 of the trials were judged to be at high risk of overall bias, with the remaining trials risk of bias being unclear. And the high risk of bias was largely attributable to inadequate blinding of participants and personnel, as well as selective reporting of data. So in summary, on this first investigation, we found that actually we've got a relatively small quantity of highly biased short-term clinical trials that are largely focused on studying the effects of heated tobacco products on exposure to harmful chemicals in healthy smokers, which isn't exactly representative of world use. So following this, we wanted to take a look at the data itself. And so in particular, we were interested in how useful was this data. Now, we know that lung cancer is one of the biggest killers of tobacco users worldwide. And so we asked ourselves, what can the current biomarker data from these trials tell us about the lung cancer risk posed by heated tobacco products? And so we established some criteria by which we could assess that question and assess the appropriateness of the biomarker data. And using those criteria, we identified only 16 of the biomarkers measured across the existing trials at that point could provide any meaningful information on the risk posed by heated tobacco products. 7 exposure biomarkers and 9 potential harm biomarkers, otherwise known as biomarkers of risk or effect. And in fact, when we looked even deeper, only 3 of the exposure biomarkers significantly improved in smokers who had switched to heated tobacco products and were not significantly different from those who had ceased smoking altogether. The remaining 13 either did not improve, in fact, in some cases worsening upon switching to heated tobacco products, or were inconsistently affected across the studies. We also found that there were obviously no appropriate data for assessing the lung cancer risk in non-smokers who took up heated tobacco products. Not surprising, given that most of the studies were conducted in smokers. So then we asked ourselves, what about the broader data and health effects of heated tobacco products? So a couple of years ago, we reran the searches to include not just trials that assessed heated tobacco products, but narrow that down slightly further to only include those which measured biomarkers of potential harm and or adverse events, the real sort of health outcomes available from these trials. And so we found that there were 31 interventional clinical trials investigating heated tobacco products that measured biomarkers of potential harm or adverse events. 7 of which were independent studies, and 24 of which, again, we're seeing the majority here, were industry affiliated. Across these, 129 unique biomarkers of potential harm were measured, in addition, of course, to adverse events and serious adverse events. And we grouped these biomarkers into their sort of physiological categories, which you can see on screen. Now, this is a huge data set. I cannot tell you how large the Excel file was for this, and I've tried to summarize our findings here visually for this slide. What we essentially did was analyze whether the heated tobacco products had a beneficial or harmful effect on each biomarker of potential harm compared to cigarettes, electronic cigarettes, and smoking cessation. And what you can see is that while HTPs had largely beneficial effects denoted by the green color on biomarkers of endothelial dysfunction and oxidative stress compared to cigarettes and e-cigarettes, the effects were actually largely mixed across the board, so denoted by the orange and yellow colors, with both beneficial and harmful effects being observed across the different studies. More interesting than that is that the mixed effects were observed in both ambulatory and confined conditions. So in confined conditions, as I said, that should have been strict adherence to the heated tobacco product or other assigned intervention. Under ambulatory conditions, perhaps we might expect to see less beneficial effects, as some participants may have reverted back to smoking. We also note that there was no significant difference, hence the blue color, in the number of participants who reported adverse or serious adverse events between heated tobacco product and any other comparator groups. And so in reality, despite contrary rather to what the tobacco industry is telling us, the clinical data on the health effects and harms to date is not clear-cut The data do not provide a clear indication either way as to the health risks of heated tobacco products, though they certainly show that there could be some beneficial effects, but equally there are some harmful effects observed in users. Thus far in this presentation, I've talked about the publicly available clinical evidence, but we know that the tobacco industry has a long documented history of scientific misconduct, especially secretly working to influence science in its interest. In our most recent work, we examined newly leaked documents from Philip Morris Japan, that is the Japanese arm of Philip Morris International, which detailed some of the company's efforts to manipulate the evidence around heated tobacco products and wider tobacco harm reduction. Our examination revealed that Philip Morris was using multiple known tactics to influence science, including but not limited to using a third party to convert lease fund research. So in this case, Philip Morris Japan wanted to fund some cessation research by Kyoto University academics. And rather than fund them directly, meaning the academics would have to declare that funding, they passed the funding through a third party CMIC. And in fact, in later publications, which have now since been retracted, the academics noted CMIC's previous funding, but failed to acknowledge Philip Morris Japan's, despite knowing where the funding was actually coming from. We also found out that Philip Morris was secretly paying a life sciences consultancy around 3 million yen or 20,000 Great British pounds a month to conduct all manner of science adjacent work, most significantly building relationships and co-opting what they called key opinion leaders in academia, policy, science. And we found that actually some of the people that this consultancy had noted as having been successfully introduced to Philip Morris had gone on to talk at conferences promoting PMI-friendly messaging. And then lastly, in one document in particular, they laid out their plans to leverage science and scientific messaging to build societal support for tobacco harm reduction in order to grow its IQOS market in Japan. And this included things like engaging with governments like the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Health, using scientific reports from independent bodies, but skewing them in a way that they could use to promote IQOS. They were also using third parties to try and endorse and promote their notion of tobacco harm reduction, as well as having a presence at international events like the Tokyo Olympics. What I've covered, I think, adds to the broader literature, which is constantly growing, that shows us, firstly, that the tobacco industry science on heated tobacco products is of poor quality and largely inadequate at truly assessing the public health impact of HTPs. We also know that the tobacco industry science is highly biased, and other work has since come out to show that they are often more likely to report heated tobacco products as less harmful compared to their independent counterparts. And lastly, perhaps most significantly, of course, from the last piece of work is that the tobacco industry continues to manipulate and misuse science in its own interest, ultimately for profit at the expense of public health. And so where does that leave us? Well, the tobacco industry is constantly curating, adapting, and expanding its menu of addiction and harm, and heated tobacco products are just another item on this menu. Science is fundamental to our understanding of all the items listed on it that are available to the public. And while academics and policymakers are debating the potential harms and benefits of newer products, it's important that we remember that we continue to see evidence that the tobacco industry's vested interests are working against us by trying to influence science and muddy the information water. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And I hope you hear the audience clapping somewhere in the distance. That was really a very fascinating talk, and I probably I think I've never seen a talk better animated than the one you just gave. Congratulations. Well, thank you very much for that. For those who were listening, so you can now start raising your digital hands if you would like to ask a question directly to Sophie, or you can use the Q&A button to type in your question. Meanwhile, maybe I can kick off with one or two questions. Can you tell us, because you made this distinction between confined use and non-confined use, so let's say laboratory settings, optimal settings in which these products are used, compared with how they are used in the real world, let's say. Can you tell us a little bit more how this use differs in these two settings?
Yeah, of course. So, as I explained, under the confined settings, as you've just said, they're strictly monitored. So if you were a participant, you would not be allowed to deviate from the product you've assigned. So if you're, most of them, as I said, were smokers, the smoker would come in. If they were assigned a heated tobacco product, they would have to use exclusively the heated tobacco product, so no other products. And they would also have to use it in a manner that was consistent with the amount that they had been smoking, usually based on, you know, sort of per sticks per day that they would typically use, or nicotine quantities they would typically consume. And that's great at understanding efficacy. So at its best, how good would or what are the effects rather of a product? But then obviously we know that in the real world, that's not always how things happen. So under the ambulatory conditions, the participants were allowed to take their interventions home. But equally, that means that they are free and unsupervised and can use other products. And actually, what we saw in most of these trials that included ambulatory settings, a significant portion, you know, as high as 50% of the participants assigned heated tobacco products actually reverted back to smoking at some level. And so there you're sort of measuring effectiveness, right? Because there's some interplay. You've then, the effects that you're seeing could also have been impacted by the cigarette use they've gone back to. But equally, that's probably going to be more representative overall of the effects that you would see in individuals using them in the real world.
Right. And let's say beyond clinical trials, is there any data from, let's say, surveys, population studies on how heated tobacco products are really used by people
Yeah,
and
and
how that differs from these clinical settings, let's say?
an excellent question. So often I will hear about Philip Morris in particular touting about, I don't know what the number is now, 20 odd million users of IQOS that have successfully quit smoking. And then there's a little asterisk that said, oh, quit in the last 7 days, and only in their studies, which they haven't published. In reality, what we're seeing from independent survey data on prevalence and use is that the majority of heated tobacco product users are what we call dual or poly using. That is to say, the vast majority are not using heated tobacco products alone, and most commonly, they're continuing to smoke cigarettes. And so, really, people are not substituting heated tobacco products for cigarettes rather for heated tobacco products. In reality, they're using both, and there's actually some evidence slowly emerging to suggest that people who do that are actually increasing their tobacco consumption, which of course does nothing for reducing the risks of disease and death.
Great. And while I invite everyone again to ask questions if you want to, I have another one, if I may. And that was the distinction you made at the beginning of your talk between the two parts of the product, which are the sticks on the one hand that contain tobacco, and then the device, the electronic device itself. And my question is, can you tell a little bit more about this regularly loophole, how it looks like nowadays? Because just as an example, Germany doesn't score very well on the tobacco control scale, as you perhaps know, and we only recently banned tobacco advertising in public. And now, since a couple of months, I see heated tobacco products again on billboards. And if you look closer, what you see is the electronic device. And probably that's allowed, I assume, because the billboard advertisement doesn't show the tobacco. What is the situation like maybe in the UK, or do you know anything about this distinction between the tobacco stick and the electronic device?
So in the UK, as a sort of country level example, things have got slightly better actually on the back of e-cigarettes. So in the UK, heated tobacco products are not very popular. Rather, e-cigarettes are way more popular. But because of that, we had some legislation that came about in 2016 that started to specifically name not just the nicotine containing components or the tobacco containing components, but any components that are used or that are, I forget the exact wording in the legislation, but it's something like anything that would be necessary to successfully use the device as a consumer. So that would, of course, include the electronic devices. And then more broadly around the world, it really varies. But we are seeing on the back of tobacco industry influence and lobbying, lots of countries introducing what is being called science-based or evidence-based regulation, which on the surface sounds like a great thing and is something I totally agree with. But often what that means is it's just the industry science. So the companies get to submit their science, which looks great and says heated tobacco products are less harmful, full stop, you know. And on the back of that, then they will get less tax or easier regulations or better access to the market. So yeah, it's really varied, and it's still something that plays in. And you do still see examples where countries have not brought in newer product regulation, where the devices are still being marketed quite widely, and the sticks are then sort of kept off to the side so that they don't break any technically break any rules.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm looking at the time, and I think we have to proceed.